All right, so one of the things I want you to concentrate on with this section on epidemiology is going to be the routes of infection. And in terms of these routes of infection, these can pertain both to bacteria and to viruses, all right? So I want you to concentrate on the 9 different ways that diseases can be transmitted, all right? The first one is going to be respiratory or droplet, all right? What you want to think about in terms of respiratory or droplets are things like sneezing, okay? The key here is you've got kind of a wet transmission that's going on, all right? In contrast to one of the other ones on our list, airborne, all right? With airborne, you might think, well, what the heck's the difference between it being airborne and it being respiratory, okay? Respiratory typically means you have the infection associated somewhere with the respiratory system. You sneeze, you cough, you release viral particles, okay? That's the way the flu can be transmitted. Measles can be transmitted this way, all right? Airborne, we're talking about particles. It's typically a dry transmission. Things like anthrax would be transmitted via airborne because those bacteria associated with the disease anthrax produce endospores. Those endospores go into the air, you inhale them, that would be an airborne transmission, okay? So those two kind of can be a little confusing to understand the difference. Really, basically, wet versus dry is kind of the simplistic way of thinking about it, okay? Next type of infection we've got are going to be fomites. This is going to be via objects, all right? If you're taking microbiology lab with me, this mode of infection or transmission is why I get so bitchy about bringing cell phones into the microbiology lab. Because when you're working around known infectious materials, you don't want to transfer that infectious material to an object and then off of that object transfer it somewhere else, okay? In the case of the cell phone in microlab, you transmit that strep pyogenes to your cell phone, you bring your cell phone home, your 2-year-old decides, hey, cell phone, let me put it in my mouth. You've then just resulted in a mode of transmission that allows your child to end up with strep throat, okay? So fomites are going to be objects, all right? The cell phone is one I'm passionate about in microlab, but in a healthcare setting, all right, things like stethoscopes can be a fomite, all right? The bed that the patient is in can be a fomite if it's not cleaned correctly. We're talking about a fomite being a solid object, all right? Fomite might also be the desk that's sitting in front of you. You sneeze, you rub your nose, you put your hand down. Next person who sits down at your desk puts their hand down, rubs their nose. They've transferred potentially that flu virus that you have to them, okay? So we're talking about needing a solid object there, all right? Direct contact, that one's kind of clear, all right? This is going to be things like kissing, sexual contact, all right? Physically, you have to come in contact with the person. Okay? Fecal-oral, we talked a little bit about with the polio virus. It goes from human waste to the oral cavity. All right? And in terms of fecal-oral disease, these very often are diseases that are associated with things like diarrhea. So fecal-oral very often tends to affect the gastrointestinal system as a general principle, okay? We can also have transmission or routes of infection via vectors, all right? We talked about this a little bit with the Zika virus and the dengue virus. Mosquitoes play a big role in that. You can also have something as easy as the common housefly. This is why if you've ever worked in a restaurant and the health inspector comes through, if there are lots of flies in the area, that doesn't bode well, because those houseflies, they'll land on trash, they'll land on fecal matter, they'll land on all kinds of stuff, and little bits of bacteria or viruses will stick to the insect. That insect then lands on your hamburger that has been prepared by the chef. They walk all over it, and now they've transferred those bacteria or that virus to your hamburger, okay? So vector involves an insect in some way transmitting the bacteria or virus to the human population, okay? So we've got our first 6. Parenteral, this one is going to be important, especially since you all are going to be future healthcare providers. This is essentially transmission of disease by direct contact with blood. So if you stick someone with a needle, say they have HIV, you don't properly dispose of that needle and you stick yourself, that would be parenteral infection, okay? Direct contact with the blood that remained behind in that needle, okay? Typically, this one's going to occur in a healthcare setting. Deep wounds are another one, all right? Cuts. Typically what we're talking about there, tetanus, because the bacteria that causes tetanus is a soil bacteria. If you cut yourself, the cut gets dirty, you can introduce that tetanus into the wound, can result in disease, okay? Last one is going to be horizontal. This is going to be involving disease transmission from mom to baby. So anything that can cross the placenta, so the Zika virus, transmitting that from mom to baby, those babies that are born with the microcephaly, that would be an example of horizontal transmission. Even though the Zika virus itself, in the adult, the transmission was a vector-based, okay? You have to look at who's infected. In this case, if the infant comes out of the womb infected, it went mom to baby. Syphilis is another example of something that can cross the placenta. The bacteria that causes syphilis crosses the placenta, can impact the growth of the baby as far as that goes. So horizontal transmission, mom to baby. If you have any questions,